Welcome to Study Sesh, everyone. I'm Camilla, and today we are talking landmark court cases. I want you to think of them a bit like trailblazing, but in a legal sense. Now, when you think of a trailblazer, right, there's someone who goes out into the wilderness, into uncharted territory, if you will. They blaze a trail that the rest of us can follow easily. Think of hiking up Table Mountain, for instance. These days, it's something that if you're fit enough, not like me, you can do it in a morning. You follow a clearly marked trail, and in the really rough parts, there are bridges or chains or other signs, other things that help you get through the rough parts. But the very first person to climb Table Mountain was in a very, very different boat. They didn't have a path to follow, right? They had no help. They were nevertheless able to blaze that trail. It would have taken them an enormous amount of work and probably didn't just take them a morning, but they were able to blaze that trail and make it easier for everyone else to follow. And today's Study Sesh is all about that in a legal sense. It's about a pivotal moment in South Africa's legal history, a landmark court case that changed lives and legal precedents, and it's called the Grootboom case. And if you're not familiar with it yet, you're about to get very, very intimately acquainted with it. So to help us navigate this topic, we've got Gadiel. She's a legal expert who can really help us understand why landmark cases like Grootboom matter, and also what lasting impact they can have. So welcome, Gadiel, and I want to start with a broad question. Landmark cases, as we know, they're not just footnotes in legal textbooks, right? They're turning points a lot of the time. Can you unpack for us why cases like Grootboom are critical, not just for the legal community, but for society at large?
Thanks, Camilla, and thanks for having me here with the Study Sesh. I'm very excited to dive into it. So there's several reasons why landmark cases are important and make an impact on society. The one thing that I can think of off the top of my head is legal precedent. So these cases, especially in the situation of the Grootboom case, which is a constitutional court matter, set authoritative interpretations of the law and of constitutional provisions. They also guide future legal decisions and have the ability to shape legal principles and doctrines.
So much like you'd have trail markers on a trail guiding people from one point to the next as they hike, these legal cases can move our understanding of the law further.
Absolutely. I think the description you've used there as a trailblazer is exactly what legal precedents do. And then I think another reason that these landmark cases are important is in the sense that they deal with contentious issues quite a lot. And they look at, for instance, the fundamental rights and freedoms of people. And the courts in these cases look at the scope and the limits of these rights that are being interpreted, thus clarifying them not only for individuals, but for organizations, policymakers, legal practitioners, and basically just society at large.
Gadiel, let's get specific to give people an example of how this might happen and how we can use cases like this to understand bigger implications as well. So let's get specific with Grootboom. This case really centered around the right to adequate housing. It's a fundamental issue for many, many people in South Africa. Before we dive into the outcomes of Grootboom, could you give us a bit of a backstory to this case? What was it all about?
So the matter of Grootboom, basically what was happening was there were a bunch of marginalized and disadvantaged people living in an informal settlement. The private property was earmarked for low-cost housing developments. Thus, the government evicted or tried to evict these people, and these disadvantaged groups that lived in the informal settlements brought a court order based on the constitutional rights, which is also a socio-economic right contained in the Bill of Rights, for access to adequate housing, and that this was being infringed upon, along with the right to the best interests of the child, so which is Section 28 of the Constitution, thus kind of showing how these rights, socio-economic rights in general, are interpreted together. So that's basically the background of the story. And ultimately, I think we'll get to the outcome of it. but there were a lot of obligations placed on the state to ensure that the right to access to adequate housing is progressively realized.
So let's dive into those outcomes and those impacts, and I'll take us step by step, if you don't mind. The first thing I want to look at is really the impact that this had in terms of socio-economic rights. As you've already mentioned, Grootboom was a game changer for socio-economic rights. How did it help bring these rights to the forefront in South Africa?
So I think in terms of socio-economic rights, it's important to remember that the right to adequate housing is linked to other rights, such as the right to equality, the right to dignity, the right to privacy. These are all inherent to the right to access to adequate housing. And this case brought to light that everything is interdependent. And it brought to light the very importance of these fundamental rights and that they should be protected by governments, officials, through public policies and things like that.
It also brought to the fore the obligations of the state, right? The ruling clarified that the state's obligations regarding housing needed to be delivered upon. What does this mean for government accountability?
So in terms of the right to adequate housing, if you look at the Housing Act, for instance, the government has an obligation. It has a positive obligation and a negative obligation. So Section 26 in the Constitution is split into two different parts. So there's a negative right in the sense that the government must not interfere with the right to access to adequate housing. But on the other spectrum of things, they must promote and progressively realize this right. So they must implement policies which actually come to realize this right, making housing accessible, especially to marginalized and previously disadvantaged communities.
We're speaking a lot about the interdependence of rights as well. And of course, Grootboom, as you've already mentioned, really did underscore different rights and how they are connected. What do you think is the benefit of this to communities, this holistic view, if you will, of human rights? What is the benefit to both individuals, I suppose, and then communities?
It addresses the social impact. So it doesn't look at a specific right in isolation, in the sense that if you take into consideration the right to dignity, the right to privacy, the right to equality, it also has a social impact, looking at things outside of the law. And the law is a way to, if you interpret it holistically through the Constitution and apply it holistically, it has many different benefits for the individual and for the community at large.
Okay, so the Grootboom case really helped us think clearly about things like the interdependence of rights, the obligations of the state, and the recognition of socio-economic rights in South Africa. But it did even more for the country and for our society at large, if you think about it. I mean, let's talk about tangible changes that actually stemmed from Grootboom. So here I'm thinking, what shifts in housing policy, social programs, that sort of thing. Were there tangible benefits and results that came out of this ruling?
So housing policies were being established and implemented where governments had to, within the available resources, make active and concrete plans to realize this right. So one can, for instance, think of how the government started building RDP houses. It has an influence, this case, the Grootboom case, has an influence on the government's obligations to start actually developing housing rights in South Africa and putting that obligation on them to make a concrete and effective change.
Now, Gadiel, Grootboom also reached beyond South Africa's borders. It wasn't just about us. Could you share how this case has influenced discussions or approaches to the housing problem outside of our own borders?
Absolutely. So I think it has had a large international influence, especially with countries that have similar socioeconomic situations when compared to South Africa. For example, in Spain, they suffer with the favelas, as they call it, which would be their informal settlements. They struggle with situations where they also marginalize people previously disadvantaged people. And the Grootboom case had quite a large international influence in that sense. And obviously a lot of journal articles all around the world, including the US, has made reference to Grootboom. So it's had a massive impact globally, I would say.
And I think that's one of the key things to remember about landmark cases is that they generally have enormous influence, not only in one specific area, but in many different areas and sometimes across borders as well. I have a last question for you, Gadiel. And this is for anyone who's grappling with the complexities of landmark cases, students who might be trying to get their heads around this. Grootboom offers obviously a wealth of learning opportunities, as we've heard. Any advice from you on how students can approach Grootboom and other cases like it to really understand their broader implications, as we've just unpacked?
I think the importance stems from, or how to unpack a landmark case is to consider it in its broader context. Look at it not only from a legal framework, look at it from a social framework, the impact that it has on your community. Imagine you were placed in that community, how it would affect you specifically, how it would affect your community. And think of the way that it has advanced justice, advanced equality, and the significance that it brings to people in your space, in your world. We see marginalized and disadvantaged people all over the country. So start thinking about it practically, and then you'll see the effective changes that need to be made and how matters like Grootboom can assist with that change effectively.
Wonderful. Gadiel, I'm a journalist and there's a question we ask at the end of every interview, and I want to ask it to you as well. And that is there a question about landmark cases or about Grootboom that I should have asked you but haven't? Anything else that you'd like to add that you think is pertinent to the conversation that we haven't covered yet?
For me, specifically, the importance thereof is recognizing that socioeconomic rights are justiciable, which means that the courts interpret them in a certain way. So there's no law specifically saying, besides the Constitution, privacy must be dealt with in XYZ manner. And that's why it's the court's duty to interpret and clarify these rights for us. So looking at the Grootboom case, it clarified the rights of access to adequate housing. So you'll even see in, for instance, the Housing Act itself, adequate housing is not defined. So that's where it becomes important to consider landmark cases, especially in the context of how it sets judicial precedent.
Gadiel, thank you so much for guiding us through the landmark Grootboom case, its profound impact on human rights law and on policy. And it's clear after this discussion that this case wasn't just a milestone in legal history, but a touchstone too for justice and for equality. So remember everyone, the Grootboom case and others like it are vital reminders of the power of legal action to spark change, as well as the need for us to keep advocating for fundamental rights here in South Africa and around the world. Catch you next time on Study Sesh.